Now for the aside section, I'm going to be targeting these headlines and these paragraphs. There are headlines in here. If I were to click on this area, select it, and go into the source code, you can see it says in the aside there's actually some divs in place. There's 3 of them separating 3 different areas of content. Not necessarily all that important for us at the moment, but in the next website that we're going to be building, a little bit more important. However, at the beginning of every one of these simple little H1s, I'd like to have a little icon here showing so that we can make it look a little bit more visually appealing. So what I want you to do is to, number 1, come into the sponsors area that we happen to have right here. And we are now going to be targeting and seeing how we can put in a little bit of information, a little bit of extra information. So what I'd like you to do is to introduce inside of these areas a little span tag. Now there's a number of different ways that we can do that, right? But I think the easiest way is to just go into our code and to type out the word span. Now the first span that I'm going to be using is the letter L, and we'll have a / closing span. You can even copy that if you wish, and you can paste it into the beginning of the next one. And this one can have a letter P, and then you can do the same thing in this area. Command V, Control V on a PC to paste. And here I'm just going to put in the word K. Alright, if we were to refresh that, not really anything all that fancy, it just looks like some letters in place of what we had. Okay, perfect. So now we're getting ready to get into our asides and start styling them. So before we target the span itself, I think I would like to target the headlines just to get the size looking okay and see what that can do for us. So I'm going to ask you to put your cursor right in here inside of the H4, and we'll go to our CSS and we will just say new CSS rule. Well, compound based on our selection tells us a couple of things. It says in wrapper, aside, div, H4. Well, we can be less specific, and in fact I don't even necessarily need to address the div. I think it can work just as well if we said aside H4. So let's click OK. I'll click in here and open up our CSS rule definition, and what we want to do with this is, number 1, I do still want to be using the Museo 500 font, so I'll choose that. I'm going to give it a font size of 1.2 ems. So it's going to have some size, a little bit bigger than it is normally for a H4. And the only other thing is we can give it a color of some kind. I'm just going to keep it the gray that we have so far. So if I click OK, you can see that, number 1, those elements have been styled. Great. Now the next thing I want to do is to position my cursor right inside one of these spans. And then if we click on our CSS styles, if you have the aside H4 at the bottom, you can just bring it underneath the aside here. I'm going to click new CSS rule. I'm going to be less specific. And again, I don't necessarily think we need the div area in there. Basically here, by eliminating it, I'm saying, look, in any aside, any H4 that has a span in it will look the way we're going to be dictating. So what do we want to do? I'm going to click OK. And you've already seen how I can add many different new styles of fonts. And I did this inside of our modify menu before. And what I have here is another foundation icon, but this one I want to use the enclosed versions. They're a little bit different from the other ones. They're smaller and they're in circles. So I'm just going to click OK, see what that looks like to begin with, and you can see, beautiful, right away they are putting in some different styles of icons. That's great. Okay, a couple of other things though. You'll notice that those icons are rather tight against the edges of elements. So first of all, what I want to do is to increase its size to 1.2 ems just to make sure should be fine, but just to make sure it's looking good. So it's increased that size a little bit, as you can see here. So that's looking great. Now, given the fact that they're tight, I think there's a way that we can get that around that without necessarily having to jump through CSS hoops. If I just click OK, let's go back in here and notice the L and the S are right next to each other. There's no space. So I'm just going to put in a little space with my space bar. Beautiful. That's exactly what we need. We didn't need to jump through any hoops. So I'll just do this for the other ones. Now they look just great. Perfect. So before we move on, however, I want to now address this paragraph that we have in here. So I'll click on it. We'll go to our CSS rule, click on New CSS, and we will be less specific. Again, I don't think I need that div information. So just any aside, any P in that aside. So we'll click OK, bring up our CSS rule definition. Again, what I want to do is perhaps change the way the font looks here. Right now it's a serif font. So I'm going to choose Museo Sans 500. And this time we want it a little bit smaller. So I'm going to choose 0.75 ems. And that's going to be smaller than it is normally. The only other thing I want to do is to play with the margin space. So let's take a look. We're going to come back with the margin in a second. I'm just going to click OK, and I'm just going to move this so we could see what it looks like. In fact, let's go to the design view. That's better. Perfect. So you can see that it is certainly smaller than the other ones, even the headlines here, and smaller than the text that's here, but that's good. This is an aside. This is secondary text. It should not be as important as the other elements in here. So keeping things reasonably sized makes a much better design. But let's also add a little bit of extra space. I think I want to separate them just a little bit more. So I'll open up that aside paragraph. Let's see. I think I want to move the span information in the aside paragraph up here with the rest of the asides. I'll double click it, bring up my rules yet again. And as long as I can see one of these paragraphs down here, that's fine. So I'll go to my box, and for my margin, I think I'll just put in a nice fixed pixel amount of 20. Click OK. Now you can see much more space in here. It's looking exactly the way I want it to. So I'm going to click OK, collapse this so you can see it, and that's beautiful. It's looking just great. So when we come back in the next video, let's take care of our footer area, and that will pretty much wrap up what we want to be doing in the typography lesson.